Chapter 8. The Perfect Fit. The baby herself looked pretty blue and wrinkled, and I wasn't too sure she was breathing. But her mother grabbed her, turned her upside down, and smacked her bottom just like she was a newborn. In response, the baby gasped out loud and spit up an ounce or two of dirty looking water. Her mother immediately turned her right side up again and blew some air into her mouth, but very gently, like she was drying off a butterfly's wing. Almost immediately the baby started to cry, while her mother shook off her wet clothes and wrapped her up in her own big scarf. Then she started to cry too. "Oh, thank you, she's alive, she's alive!" That's just about all she could say, while she cuddled the baby close to her face and kept her warm. After a minute or two of that, we all walked back to Jude Mason's house behind the livery stable. Jude's wife found a fresh blanket for the baby, whose name I learned was Hannah Bandela. Her mother didn't seem to realize that the kids would change that to either Hannah Banana or Hannah Bandana in a few more years, but at the time I didn't think I should bring it up. Mrs. Mason also tried to find something dry for me to wear too, but she didn't have any kids and all she could come up with was a flannel shirt 11 sizes too big, plus a pair of pants so long I almost couldn't roll the bottoms up far enough to take a step. But I didn't care. By then I was really cold, so I much preferred to wrap myself up in another blanket right over the top of those clothes until I warmed up again. Jude himself disappeared into a bedroom and came back out a few minutes later, his wet hair combed and dry clothes on. They already had a small fire going in the fireplace, so he threw on more wood and we all sat around it for an hour or so, warming up and calming down. Finally, Mr. Jude went outside, hitched up some horses, and offered to take us all home. On the way, Mrs. Bandela showed me Hannah's pink little face, by then so peaceful and calm and perfectly healthy. "She owes her life to you," her mother said, "and I'll make sure she never forgets." "That's all right," I said. "I'm just glad I was able to help. It was a scary time, but I'm glad it all worked out. The strange thing," she went on, "is that based on how this all happened, I don't think there's another person in town who'd be strong and mature enough to do what you did, yet small enough to fit through that opening in the back of the carriage, and do it all so fast. You were a godsend, Deli, a true godsend, sent straight down here at exactly the right moment. I won't forget that either. By that time, you were approaching my neighborhood, and I was only too happy to get inside, where my mother could put some ointment on my sore back. Turns out I had some real scrapes back there, not bad enough to bleed me dry, but painfully enough to hurt for 3 or 4 more days. Mrs. Bandela insisted on coming in with me to talk to my parents. By then it was very late in the afternoon, so I was grateful to have someone else explain why I'd been gone so long. On the following morning, Mrs. Bandela must have talked to someone in the local newspaper office too, because in the afternoon they sent a reporter over to talk to me and get my side of the story. The day after that was Thursday, and they ran a front page article in the morning paper calling me a hero. Strangely enough, a year or so after that, when they thought I'd tripped up the world's clumsiest bank robber, the local newspaper sent out the same guy to talk to me again and printed the same kind of article. But that's another story entirely. Thursday afternoon, some good Samaritan even found my fishing pole and brought it by my house, which seemed awfully kind at the time. A bit later on, Cake Baker knocked on the door and asked me if I'd go to the meeting of her youth group with her again that evening. For me, it was a no-brainer, and Cake and I wound up talking for a couple of hours, so long, in fact, that my mother invited her to stay for supper. That evening, when Cake and I walked into Brian Morgan's house, at least a dozen people were already there. They instantly stood up and started clapping and cheering. At first I was confused, but once I realized it was all for me, I wished I hadn't come. I'm sure I smiled and thanked everyone, but to be honest, the whole evening was a blur except for the moment when Mr. Morgan asked me to put aside all the talk about glory and honor and tell them how I really felt about what had happened 2 days before. I think he knew exactly what he was doing, because that broke the dam. Finally, I got my eyes dried enough to see and recovered my voice enough to talk without choking on every word. "I'm sorry. But I don't believe in God anymore, I finally said, in the shakiest voice I'd ever heard come out of my own mouth. I don't believe in him because after what happened 2 days ago, I know for sure that he's not only real, but he cares about me, of all people. And he cares about that little baby, and he cares about her mother too. I don't just believe anymore because I absolutely know. At that point, my eyes filled up again, and it took me at least a whole minute to get my voice back. Finally, I started once more. Plus, he knows exactly how to work things out when the time comes because there's just no way any of this could have happened quickly enough to save that baby's life. He kept enough water out all by himself so little Hannah could breathe a few times before the window broke. And then he got us out of there and back to the top of the river before either one of us ran out of breath or took in too much water. I don't think anyone else said a word for another whole minute, but I wasn't the only one with watered up eyes in that room. Mrs. Morgan finally put her arms around me and hugged me, and that broke the dam one more time. You realize, Deli, that only God could have known that you'd be the perfect fit. For a minute, I didn't understand, but she gave me a few seconds to catch on before she continued. How long do you think you were underwater yourself? I didn't have a clue, so I could only shake my head. I've thought about that ever since it happened, and I still don't really know. But I think it must have been at least 2 minutes in ice cold water on a single breath. And you know my lungs can't possibly be that big. I didn't have to explain a thing beyond that. Everyone knew exactly what I was talking about. The only other thing I remember about that evening came when Mr. Morgan insisted on talking once again about fruits of the Spirit. I think the process has already started for you, Deli, he began. No matter how much God got involved, you couldn't possibly have cared enough to risk your life that way without feeling some kind of love for that little person. You were also faithful, patient, and unbelievably self controlled at the same time. And now I'm sure you feel joy and peace about the whole thing, all of which are fruits that come directly from God Himself. I didn't know how to answer, so I just sat there. But I knew Mr. Morgan was right, because the same thoughts had worked their way through my head a dozen times over the last 2 days. Later that evening, Cake Baker and I walked home together again. I think we held hands part of the way, not because there was anything else going on, but simply because we felt such a bond. A God bond, if you know what I mean. We were two of His beloved children, and both of us knew it for sure. That's part of what I think we'll all be so aware of when we are in heaven together someday. When we got to my place, Cake Baker planted a smacker on my cheek before she let me go in. Many years later, I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about that.